Now we're now standing in the Burnley Gardens, and the last video cut out, I think it was just a capacity thing, I hope so. And so, Andrew, this is where you are, the head gardener, effectively. You're managing these really beautiful historic gardens, and I can't help but pan in onto the giant oak. And I guess the relevance of these gardens to this sort of food production class is that, we talk a lot about food forests in urban agriculture, and that's based on the idea of a sort of multi-layered, complex planting which is edible. And I always sort of do a kind of critique which says, well, that's all very well, but these things don't just look after themselves. So I guess, and this is where the discussion is more about urban green space generally, parks and gardens, because the older the gardens in Melbourne, the more complex they are. They have big trees, they have medium-sized trees, then you get into a shrub layer, and then you get right down to this herbaceous layer here at the herbaceous border, as it's called. So, I guess, I'm working off the assumption that horticultural complexity, even if it's largely exotic here, although there's a lot of Australian rainforest plants, they're pleasant. People generally respond to diverse gardens with shady nooks, walkways, and I suppose that comes at a cost. So I'm interested in, I guess, any of your views on what it's like to manage this landscape, but particularly the fact that in our climate, it does need irrigation, and just what the quantity of water is that goes on to this landscape.
Yeah. Look, even something like this perennial border.
Yep.
We actually, we talk about microclimates a lot.
Right.
But, you'd be surprised, or maybe you won't be surprised, that this actually has 2 zones for its irrigation.
Okay.
Because we've got the trees at the back.
Yep.
In the rainforest, then that becomes much drier than the front section.
Right. Yep.
So we actually need to have almost 2 irrigation schedules for it.
Right.
And it's pretty simple. We actually just have a manual switch off thing, so we can switch off the front.
Right.
And then we can leave the back on, because it actually has that root competition. And of course, one of the trade-offs with having large trees is that, they're pumping it out all the time. And you may think that, all right, it gets to May and you turn the irrigation off and you don't turn it on again until October or November. But there are areas in these shady areas, whether classic shady walk or some of these other areas that do have a lot of complexity with tall trees and shrubs, where you do have to leave it on the irrigation.
So that's really relevant to this discussion in this class, is because the food forest concept almost makes out that you can sort of ignore those competitive effects, especially in terms of, in this case, water. But you're saying, I didn't know that actually about the border having the 2 zones. So that's fascinating.
Yeah, because what you'll notice is that things will start to wilt, and if we have it off all the time. And look, Burnley came from a very low base when it comes to the irrigation. It didn't have any water tanks. It was really reliant on hoses and taps with impulse sprinklers. And when I first began working here as a gardener, we would drag them out and move them around, and it was very time consuming. It was almost like at least half of your day was just taken up by moving sprinklers and fiddling around with them. Really was a big time waster. And really the millennium drought it was almost like overnight. You could no longer do that anymore, whether it be filling up ponds or just having an overhead sprinkler. So we had to come up with other ways of doing things. So we pretty much just completely redid everything. It took about 3 years. The first summer was a bit sort of just put in anything, and then we found out that a lot of things just didn't work, whether it be the so-called recycled leaky pipe made from recycled tyres. It sounded like a good idea, but there was no ability to actually know how much water was actually being putting out. One part of the hose was putting out 50 millimetres.
Right.
Another part of those was putting out 10 millimetres. So,
Okay.
So now we've pretty much, there's I think 1.1 hectares of garden beds.
Yep.
And they've all got this drip irrigation, which is pressure compensated. So you know that every emitter is actually putting out the same quantity of water, which is important. And the water tanks, you'd be surprised to know that even though we've got 176,000 litres capacity in those tanks, one night's irrigation of that 1.1 hectares is something like 70,000 litres. So in other words, you've really only got two and a half nights of irrigation out of the total capacity of our water tanks.
And is that equate to a summer night's irrigation? Yeah.
Well, in winter, sure, we would only have half or none of the herbaceous border on. Because remember, when we may think that this is just a spring-autumn display, but if you see at the back, we've actually got some winter flowering salvias, so they'll continue on for months. We've got other things that, so there are certain areas that we have no irrigation at all. So at the peak in summer, it would be 70,000 litres a night. Some of the other periods, it may only be 20,000. So the water tanks we use is for supplementing. And so what is different about here, I guess, to a lot of other places, we do use water all the time. So there's no point having your tanks full. You're much better off to actually use them and empty them. So then when the next rainfall event comes, you can actually just top them up again. And then. So unfortunately, there is probably a way to do it automatically, but it's far easier to just do it on a manual system where you're pretty much just turning a valve, it's coming from the tanks, turn off the valve, and it's coming from potable water.
Okay.
And the water harvesting we're getting is, depending on, it'll be different this year because we've had more rainfall in the last 3 months, but in a typical year it's about 600,000 litres were actually not non-potable water. So we're replacing potable water. 600,000 of that comes from the water tanks. So in other words, the tanks are full, we empty them, it rains again, and that equates to 600,000 litres. But some of the other interesting stats is the ponds in the native garden. They're reticulated. They run during the daylight hours. I've got a water meter on those, and they actually pretty much use the same amount of water. It's about 600,000 litres.
So the water feature is expensive water-wise.
Yeah, and that's with their lines, so you're not getting any seepage. But what you have is actually a so-called unirrigated native garden on that far end. But all the trees are actually just dipping their roots, going over the top of the liner and just sucking the water. So
and I guess that's many of those are river red gums, literally. They're just the water spenders, just constant. They love it.
So the other lily ponds that are actually concrete lined. Sure, there's a couple of salixes, willows around them. They use about a tenth. So they're using 60,000 litres.
Very interesting.
Rather than 600,000.
So if you were, let's say for argument's sake, you could exclude the ponds in the native garden from your overall water bill or quantity used. So what is it? It's excluding lawns. What did you say? 1.5 hectares of beds. Was it? 100?
Yep. And all up, we're using about changes from year to year. But the average is about 14 million litres a year. 14 million litres is actually what we're using.
And what does that?
600,000 of that
comes from tanks. Okay, so let's say, let's just call it 14 million litres. What now that excludes the field station, the veggie plots, the nursery, is what?
No, that's the whole site.
Oh, okay, that's the whole site. All
so
right.
when I break it down, about 9 million litres goes on the gardens.
Okay.
And there's something like 5 million goes to the nursery. So that
facility, that footprint
is quite different to
the
gardens, but of course.
All right. Well, let's put a figure on that then, if we can. 9 million litres to have this level of complexity, lushness, landscape richness, exotic and native layers. What does that water cost? What's the bill?
Yeah, the cost. So it's about $3.20 a kilolitre.
Yep.
So it's something like the whole bill is about $50,000 a year. So the proportion of that for the gardens is, if I've got my maths right, it's something of the order of about $25,000.
So I think that's so this is what I think is interesting, is just getting, particularly obviously horticulture students, very wise and boned up on the cost of water and matching that to an actual landscape outcome. So I mean, I guess that's to some degree subjective, but it seems to me that $20,000 for this standard of landscape and horticulture is actually worth the price, presuming that the natural resource itself is actually available and sustainable.
And remember, if I was to start irrigating the lawns, because part of what I did is with that Millennium Drought was to convert the fescue lawns to kikuyu.
Sure, really good point.
So what we're on now is a kikuyu lawn.
Yep.
This is not irrigated. Sure, we do irrigate underneath the oak tree.
Okay.
So we get a little bit of, but this year is completely different. Normally in February you'd come here and the lawns would be quite straw coloured.
That's right.
Now there are a couple of lawns that I do irrigate, and interestingly, members of the public, they do crave a green.
Yeah.
And Jeff Canellan has talked about this, the value of irrigating lawns and the perceptions for people. But if I was to start irrigating all the lawns again, as I was, so pre-millennium, we were using 29 million litres a year. And that was with overhead watering and watering of lawns. So just by not watering the lawns, majority of them, and providing drip irrigation, the water bill halved.
Fascinating. And I guess just to be clear to everyone, the advantage of these summer grasses, and particularly kikuyu, is that Andrew's talking about them getting that straw colour as they brown off, but they recover very quickly. They're drought tolerant because they recover quickly once you do irrigate them. They don't die off. They don't die, I should say.
One rain event of 10 millimetres, which is a reasonably common event in Melbourne. Then they green up within 48 hours. So it is a perception that you can see.
And I guess the thing is, obviously I've seen it here myself, when there's an event coming up, you've got pop-ups, but I've seen in the Citriodora courtyard, you get a gardener to put the manual sprinkler.
That's right. So you can just top it up, but the point is that the grass doesn't actually die; it goes dormant.
That's dormant. That's right. Okay, so I think that's a really great discussion about water cost, and I guess just to wrap up, Andrew, the gardeners here, just how many do you have? How many would you like? I guess too. How many do you have? How many would you like?
Yeah. Well, look, I was telling you before that supposedly this amount of land you'd need 7 gardeners. And what we have here is 2 full-timers. We then got another part-timer who's here 2 days a week. And a mowing crew that comes in every fortnight. So in effect, with the whole caboodle, it's probably about just less than 3 people a week equivalent who are actually maintaining these gardens. Now, a lot of it's about how you actually the management practices you do. How ground covers, uses of mulch. The sort of equipment you use. I mean, keep in mind that we were hand clipping with long-handled garden shears, the edges, whereas now they're using a brush cutter, which is pretty much a normalised maintenance regime now everywhere. So some of that, does actually reduce the labour inputs that you do need for this sort of space. Which is good. It's all about trying to, use technology and equipment to, for a better outcome.
And the theory would be that when you have efficiencies around labour on particularly kind of routine, mundane practices, you free up the time of the horticulturists or the gardeners to do better quality work, or at least the other,
Yeah, look, I think we all know that blowers have sort of permeated into, and they're pretty much, universally disliked, for their noise quality. So what I've tried to sort of enforce here is we actually do the paths by raking. So it's still it's a labour intensive, but it actually gives a better outcome. And with the predominance of the Luludale paths, what we're finding with the blowing is that would actually just blow that alkaline material off onto the edges of the garden beds. So you end up with a better looking finish and probably a better outcome for the plants as well. So you still need to, it's all about the outcome. If you can do something and you're highly skilled with a brush cutter and end up with an edge that's decent, then you.
Well, I mean that is a nice edge. A bit couple of raggedy bits, but overall pretty good.
Yeah, and so that means that probably once a year we need to get a rope out and we actually get what we call a half mooner, which is quite an old. It's like a cutting edger. And we reshape, and that is because you can imagine if you're using a brush cutter, you're just following a line, and whatever's actually there, you'll just reinforce. So if it was slightly wonky at the start, it'll be worse when you finish. That's sort of the issue with using that sort of mechanical equipment, but still rectifiable by. As long as you know what the outcome you want, then you can actually achieve that in the long term.
Okay. Well, thanks. That was a fascinating discussion. Thanks for that. It's just interesting as we've been here, plenty of people walking around enjoying the gardens during this pandemic. So thanks, Andrew. And I'll be sure to give you any feedback from students and from some follow-up questions.
Until
Thanks.
next time.
Yeah.